In Chapter 5, your textbook author presents a discussion about two media industries that are very closely related. In fact, we could almost say that they're intertwined. These two industries are the radio broadcasting industry and the recorded music industry. And the reason that they are so closely intertwined is that for the better part of 70 years, radio stations' programming has consisted largely in the presentation of recorded music. And so for that reason, we say that there's a symbiotic relationship between radio stations and the studios and artists that make recorded music. Symbiotic in the sense that they both need each other to survive, and they tend to feed off one another. Radio stations provide the recorded music industry with the opportunity to showcase the new recordings, but at the same time, were it not for the new recordings, what would the radio stations have to put on the air? So it's a question that we'll examine as we make our way through Chapter 5. Page 125 offers us a brief reminder of a subject that we've taken under consideration at least 2 times already this semester. Just a reminder that our United States Congress in 1934 passed a Communications Act, and in the language of that act is the statement where the Congress requires all local radio and TV stations to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That's the single most important phrase to come out of the Communications Act of 1934. Note that I put in quotation marks all over the air local radio and TV stations. That's to make certain that we don't accidentally bring into the discussion things like the cable TV channels, which are not broadcast over the air. It does not include satellite radio, which by definition is not broadcast over the air. But by and large, the radio stations that we're familiar with, the ones that we listen to in our car and trucks while we drive around, they come under the auspices of the the Communications Act of 1934. And in a nutshell, that phrase, serving the public interest, convenience, and necessity, is there to ensure that broadcasters use the publicly owned airwaves as a means of serving we, the listeners, and the TV viewers as well. Public interest, to bring us news and messages of importance about our local communities. Convenience, meaning at times when we tune in that we need to be able to access that information. And necessity, particularly when lives are being threatened by, let's say, atmospheric conditions, when the weather turns bad and tornadoes begin to form or hurricanes begin to form, when large snowfall or ice is expected. Those are times when broadcasters are expected to use the publicly owned airwaves to make certain that we are kept up to date and informed with the latest weather and emergency information. Now, back to that topic that I began our discussion with, this interdependency that exists between radio and recorded music. I suggest that it's a symbiotic relationship, that one needs the other in order to survive, and vice versa. Some people would say, well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe radio is a little more dependent on recorded music than vice versa. Well, that's not a discussion that I can provide a ready answer for, but it certainly is something that we want to consider as we make our way through this discussion about these two very important industries. Here's a couple of important facts about radio broadcasting. You may or may not be aware that there's 10 times as many radio stations as there are daily newspapers in the United States, and there's 10 times as many radio stations as there are TV stations. And that has to do with the very nature of the radio broadcasting industry, One of the reasons that more stations have been established is that it takes less manpower and woman power to operate a radio station than it does, for example, a daily newspaper or a TV station. And because it requires fewer human beings, the cost of operating, the expenses, can be kept at a minimum. Bottom line is we have a total number of about 17,000 radio stations that serve the United States. This is a cathedral radio that's pictured on the left-hand side of your screen. Cathedral radio from the 1930s. And that term, cathedral, is applied to this particular design of radio because it has the shape of a cathedral window. Back in the 1930s, before television came along, radio was the place where people went to listen to situation comedies, to the dramatic cops and robbers and lawyer shows and doctor shows, quiz shows, soap operas. The kiddie shows all had their beginnings on radio. Programs that we think very much today are the product of television actually had their origins, had their beginnings as radio broadcast. In the golden age of radio in the 1930s and 1940s, the idea of mass appeal programming develops, mass appeal in the electronic media. And as I said a while ago, almost all of the different kinds of programs that Americans were listening to in the 1930s and 1940s made the transition to TV in the 1950s. Radio's response to that, when all of the talented people, or at least many of the talented people, moved over into television, was to create the disc jockey format, where one person sitting behind a control board and in front of a microphone would play recorded music for the listener. On the left, you see a DJ of the 1960s. On the right-hand side of the screen, a picture from a radio broadcasting studio today, where, of course, everything is digital and is all computer-based. Some statistics about the radio industry. The latest surveys indicate that just over 22 hours a week is the amount of time that the typical teenager and young adult spends with radio programming each week. Would you believe that there are 2 times as many radio receiving sets in the United States as there are people? Our population is about 370 million people today, and there are close to 800 million radio receiving sets that are operating today, and the majority of these are in cars and trucks. And then another statistic about the nature of the industry: 4 out of 5 adult people listen to radio during what is called the morning drive time. Morning drive time being those hours of the day in which people typically are commuting on their way to work. And so the estimates are that 4 out of 5 people, more than 4 out of 5, are listening to radio while they're driving to work, at least one time each of the 5 workdays in a week's time. After television came along and radio adopted the disc jockey format of playing recorded music to entertain listeners, came the idea of the format. And in the industry today, the types of music or other types of programming that radio stations offer are described by the programming approach known as the format. Now, the format in almost all instances refers to the type of music that the station would play, but all stations are not music-based. We have some that are talk-based, and they present discussion programs. Some stations present all news broadcast. Some feature sports discussion, sports play-by-play. But like I say, the vast majority of radio stations today are music-based, music-intensive, and the style of music that they play denotes the format of the station. Top 40 playing the pop music of the day, or country music, or, well, We'll take a look at a chart in just a moment, and you'll get a better understanding of the various format labels that are currently being used by the radio industry. The whole purpose of formats is to help stations define a particular style or genre of music that they can play, and then the audience that likes that kind of music can be defined by advertisers as a target for which they wish to reach. And so the kind of music that Mom Station plays, they're advertisers that want to put their products out in front of Soccer Mom. But then there are other radio stations that might feature classic rock, which typically is a male listener and is older, and the products that are advertised on that station may be markedly different than what Soccer Mom is listening to on her radio station. So the idea is that formats help to segregate listeners into specific groups with common characteristics so that advertisers who want to reach that specific group can do so very cost effectively. Here's the chart I alluded to just a moment ago. This is a list of some of radio's most popular formats on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side you can take a look at the number of stations that are estimated to be programming that type of music. It may come as a surprise, two things I want to call to your attention. It may come as a surprise to you the total number of country music stations, and there's a really good explanation for this. Country music tends to be offered on smaller radio stations located in smaller communities, mostly in the Deep South and in the Midwest. And so because in a lot of smaller communities, and you may come from a community such as this, where there might be one or two radio stations that serve the small town, country music is most likely in this part of the United States to be the format that's offered by that station. So while there are far more country music radio stations in the United States than any other type of programming format, the fact of the matter is these tend to be in some of the smaller towns and don't reach as many listeners as they do in the larger markets, such as, well, in the major markets, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, San Francisco. And then you get into the next tier of market sizes, which would include cities such as St. Louis. St. Louis currently is the 21st largest metropolitan area in the United States for radio listening, and certainly has a variety of formats, including two mainstream country music radio stations. The other point that I needed to make from that chart, we'll follow up with on this page. The news/talk radio format is not one that's dependent on music, but is the second most listened to format in the United States and has the second largest number of stations. One of the most popular personalities that is heard in the news talk radio format, his program is broadcast nationwide, and that person is the one that's pictured on this page. His name is Rush Limbaugh, and you may or may not be familiar with Mr. Limbaugh and his program. In a typical week, 20 million Americans listen to one or more of his broadcasts, and I think he's worthy of mentioning. And again, you may be familiar with this, and you may not. Rush Limbaugh is a native of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and his family is a very prominent family in the legal profession, with the exception of Rush Limbaugh, who has certainly made a name for himself nationwide in radio broadcasting. Page 122, I just want to bring to a quick discussion this subject of payola. What you see here in this cartoon is a disc jockey playing CDs in the foreground, and in the rear, pictured in the dark suit holding the bag of money, is a person representing the recorded music industry. And basically you see the DJ talking about a CD with his arm outstretched, reaching out to the record company executive for that bag of money. That process of the record industry, or representatives of the recording studios, paying behind the back, paying money to disc jockeys in order to get them to promote certain CDs, is an activity that's called payola. It's discussed on page 122. It dates all the way back to the 1950s, and it's an act that Congress actually passed a law prohibiting, and they did so back in the 1950s, even though it still occurs in some instances today. The whole idea is that disc jockeys, or at least as far as our government is concerned, disc jockeys should be playing the popular music that listeners want to hear. They should not be accepting behind-the-scenes payoffs from industry executives in the recorded music industry to play the music of artists that probably wouldn't make it on the charts were it not for the fact that it's getting radio exposure. So it's an unfair practice. Congress recognized this way back in the late 1950s, and as I said just a moment ago, it has been illegal since then, although it does still occur in certain instances even today. When we talk about radio broadcasting, we're talking about AM and FM radio transmissions that are whose radio signals travel along the surface of the earth. And that's a term called terrestrial radio. When you see that term or hear the term terrestrial, we're talking about the traditional FM or AM radio broadcast. But today, when it comes to listening choices, well, we have a lot of different ones besides FM and AM radio. Podcasting is probably one of the most remarkable newer forms of sound media to come along in the last 10 to 15 years. And the growth of podcasting and the interest in people listening to podcasts is increasing tremendously, particularly just within the last couple of years. Podcasting gets, it gives an opportunity for average persons, such as each and every one of us, if we chose to create our own podcast and to make it available to prospective listeners on iTunes or any one of another several different types of podcasting location sources, we could all become podcasters or radio broadcasters without ever having to work for an FM or AM radio station. But listeners also have choices that include what we call DAB, digital audio broadcasting over high-def HD radio. We don't have any HD radio stations presently in Cape Girardeau, but most of the FM stations in the St. Louis market offer additional multiple channels if you have an HD radio that can receive those signals. Satellite radio, XM Sirius, provides yet another alternative. The difference here, of course, is that in order to receive Sirius XM radio, you have to be a monthly subscriber. You have to pay in order to receive the programming. The upside is, of course, that many of the music channels are commercial-free or have only a limited number of commercials on them. So there's the trade-off there. If we are willing to subscribe and if we're willing to pay a monthly fee, we can have radio broadcasting that has no or a limited number of commercials within the music. And many, many internet radio stations, not only from around the United States, but from around the world. There's a surprising number, at least in my opinion, a surprising number of radio stations from around the world that you can dial into and listen to over the internet. Now let's talk about a specialized form of radio broadcasting in the United States called public radio. And I suspect maybe you scratch your head a little bit over that term public radio. isn't all radio broadcasting public? Well, yes and no. Public radio is a term that came into popularity in the early 1970s to denote a type of broadcasting that is nonprofit and non-commercial. You're probably familiar with public TV and grew up watching Sesame Street and some of the other public TV programs. Think of this as public television as it relates to radio broadcasting. PBS, the network for public television, has a companion network in radio called NPR, National Public Radio. And you can see up at the upper right-hand corner of this screen the pages in Chapter 5 where you can read about NPR. By law, public radio cannot accept money from advertisers and broadcast commercials in return. So where does the money come from that it takes to operate the public radio stations? Well, it comes from three sources, and they're bullet pointed for you here. A portion of it comes from both federal and state government tax appropriations. A certain amount of it comes from donations that are made by business and industry. And then roughly, in most instances, roughly 1/3 of the money that it takes to operate public radio stations comes in the form of contributions by listeners who are gracious enough and appreciative enough of the kind of programming that NPR stations offer to actually contribute to sustain the operations of the stations. Now, this link that you see labeled website is not clickable in this PowerPoint presentation, but I will take you to the NPR website when we get together and discuss this radio network in class. On this page, you see the logos of several of the really popular NPR programs. Let's take a look at the two that are diagonally opposite in the upper right-hand corner and the lower left-hand corner. Beginning with Morning Edition, this is an NPR program broadcast from studios in Washington, D.C. each weekday morning, to which approximately 15 million people tune in each week, mostly when they're driving to work. The program is a 2-hour national and international news broadcast, and it has quite a loyal, devoted following by its listeners. The counterpart to Morning Edition is seen in the logo in the lower left-hand corner. At 4 o'clock every afternoon, the broadcast of All Things Considered, a 90-minute news magazine program that wraps up the events of the day for listeners. Not quite as many people listen to All Things Considered as do to Morning Edition, but still millions of Americans on their commute home after work every afternoon tune in for ATC, All Things Considered. NPR is not, as some people think, all the time serious news and discussion. On the weekends in particular, NPR goes in search of comedy, and two of the most famous of the NPR programs that feature comedy are Car Talk, which you see depicted, the two hosts of Car Talk, in the upper left-hand corner of this screen, and then the program and the people, the cast that make up the oddly informative news quiz that's called Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, the NPR News Quiz, which is broadcast every Saturday on NPR. And these programs are, occasionally they're informative, but at the same time, they're also a lot of fun to listen to. So, a brief introduction to NPR and the programming that this network offers. NPR programming is broadcast by about 550 radio stations across the United States, including the public radio station that Southeast Missouri State University operates. Its studios are located in the Serena Building, directly behind Academic Hall. The call letters of the station are KRCU, and you can listen to KRCU at 90.9 in and around Cape Girardeau, and as you travel north toward St. Louis at 88.9 on the FM band. KRCU does not broadcast paid commercials. It is prohibited by law from doing that. It is nonprofit in its operation. And it offers the kinds of programming that a certain percentage of listeners in this area are interested in hearing, but they cannot find this kind of programming on any of the commercially operated radio stations in Cape. And if you go to the KRCU website and take a look at the weekly schedule, you'll find that KRCU during the week features classical music programming. It features news and information. It features jazz music. It features alternative music. So the schedule is a little bit of something sort of esoteric, sort of unique, the kinds of music and the kinds of information programming that the commercial radio stations in Cape don't broadcast. And we'll be working with an NPR podcasting assignment that I'll discuss with you in class, and you're going to get an opportunity to choose one of the NPR programs and take a listen to it and then write a review for me. So stay tuned. I'll have much more to say about that assignment when we're in the classroom together. And as we wrap up a discussion about radio broadcasting, I want to call your attention to a documentary called Empire of the Air, The Men Who Made Radio. This is a documentary that was produced by the famous documentarian Ken Burns. Perhaps you've seen his documentaries on the Civil War or on baseball or on the national park system. He's done a documentary about the Roosevelts, who were our presidents in the early and mid 1900s. And in 1994, he made a documentary about radio broadcasting and its development. And we're going to be watching that video, and I'll have more to say about that when the time comes in class. Let's shift away to the other major industry that's discussed in Chapter 5, and that's the recorded music industry. And you can see some statistics about recorded music as as a business. In 2003, it was a $15 billion industry. In 2013, the amount of money that recorded music made for the studios and for the artist had dropped to half. And a lot of that had to do with digital music piracy, the illegal downloading of music over the internet by millions of people. And certainly when people are downloading copyrighted music for free, that means they're not going to the stores or online to buy the digital downloads. And it deprived the recorded music industry of a lot of money. The industry is just now beginning to recover from the effects of illegal downloading. Much as other forms of the mass media, the power in the recorded music industry is concentrated, for the most part, across four very large, very influential, multinational media industries. And I won't take the time to read all of the information that's in this chart for you. It appears in Chapter 5 in your textbook, but I do want to call your attention to the fact that the vast majority of all of the recorded music that we listen to comes to us as a result of the work of only four different but highly concentrated, highly converged mass media industries. Digital recording technology really began to take off in the 1990s, and that change in technology from analog to digital really had a lot to do to propel the way that recorded music is going to begin developing in the 1990s all the way up to today. In a nutshell, when digital technology becomes popular and widely used, the entrance cost, the cost of buying the equipment and starting a recording studio, becomes much more desirable, much more affordable. And so many people who 30 years ago would never have had enough money available to construct a recording studio and operate it, today, thanks to the much less inexpensive digital technology, we find a number of recording studios that artists have put into their homes, that other individuals who have enterprised and decided that they want to have a career in this industry to put studios into their homes as well. And so the ability to make recordings of performers has increased dramatically in the last 25 years, and certainly has added to an influx in a lot of new music that's available to us. My guess is that you're probably a Spotify user. The majority of you in the class, I suspect, are, and you may be a Pandora listener as well. The difference between Spotify, Spotify and Pandora is that Spotify is what we call an on-demand service, as opposed to Pandora, which is a listening service. You don't have the choice of choosing which songs and artists that you listen to on Pandora in the way that you do on Spotify. But the fact is, some of the major performers around the world are not big fans of Spotify because thanks to certain, I don't know if we would call them loopholes in the law, but Spotify certainly can exploit some of the rules about how performing artists get paid royalties, get paid a fee whenever their songs are streamed online. And so Taylor Swift, a couple of years ago, made a very important case by withholding the release of her new album from Spotify. And so if you wanted to hear the new album, your opportunity was to either to go to a physical bricks and mortar store and buy it on a CD, or perhaps more logically, to download it from a service such as iTunes. But initially, her new album was not available on Spotify, and some other artists have followed her tactics as well. And the end result is that Spotify is conceding sort of to this demand and is now paying artists more in royalties for the rights to make their music available for us to hear on the Spotify website and the Spotify app. Now, it just occurred to me we have seen this screen already, so let us wrap up at this point and take a look at some questions for thought. And as I said a while ago, when we get to the classroom, we're going to continue our discussion about this really interesting interrelationship between radio broadcasting and the recorded music industry. And we'll also talk about our next media assignment, in which you get the opportunity to choose a podcast and prepare a review for it. So I appreciate your attention in Chapter 5. I'll see you in the classroom.